Hello, Igor.
Hello, Javier.
I'm really happy to be in front of you, to have the possibility to exchange some ideas, to learn a little bit of what you're spreading around the world, and to learn from firsthand, like some of the main points, would I say, of the works that you offer, and the core of the practice.
It's great pleasure and great privilege to speaking for your distinguished publication. And it's our first time in Mexico, first time as a family, first time myself as a person, and first time with the program that we just did in Tepoztlan, which
yes.
was a 7-day retreat. We call them immersions. And it went very well. It exceeded all our expectations. So really, I'm very, very happy to be here. And it's just seems like a beautiful flow in the experience of how we came here and how things are unfolding. And this conversation that we are about to have, it feels like an icing on the cake, as the Brits say.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think you are coming back?
Well, as the Arabs say, inshallah.
Inshallah.
You know, if God's willing, we've already booked place
already?
for the next year, 2020, to have another program in exactly the same venue. A year away from now.
A 7-day retreat.
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
okay? Oh, we'll be all looking forward to it. Let me just start with a question that I had prepared. I was trying to get familiar with your knowledge, and I was surfing the internet and trying to watch some of the videos and the interviews that you have already offered. And whilst I was trying to understand the nature of your teachings, I need to say I have a Zen background, so that's like my basis to learn, or my how you say, like my parameter to learn other spiritual paths. And there was a little phrase that came into my mind when I heard you in several interviews. It's a little quote, but Thich Nhat Hanh. And he says that we are here to awaken from the illusion of separateness. How do you and your teachings would relate to this idea?
Yeah, I'm familiar. I've heard these words by Thich Nhat Hanh, and of course this line summarizes that perennial wisdom, where all traditions, one way or the other, confluence in that seminal understanding that the root of all conflicts, internal versus external, the root of all discontent, the root of not feeling enough in oneself, is in that sense of living separate sense of identities, having that separate identity that somehow one way or the other, of course different traditions address this differently, takes hold, and there we are trying to reconcile that split. So my work is not different in that respect. We do whatever is in our possibilities, whatever is available. There's this also expression, using every hook and crook to restore that original sense, which prevalent anyway beneath all this level of differentiation. At the surface level of our experience, everything seems to be ridden by opposites. But when it comes to the teachings, of course, even these opposites can be used to bring us back to that original state of union. And my work very much unfolds under this perspective that this union, although an underlying reality of our being, of who we are in essence, can be accessed through examining very carefully the nature of our experience. And as you may have encountered and you may have heard that I teach under the umbrella of Tantra.
Yes.
And Tantra unapologetically about this experience, about this life, this existence, down to the phenomenal level of what we call material level of reality. But of course, there are a lot of intricacies and a lot of ways of how to work with that. So I would say, in response to that question of how do we bridge that sense of separate self, then again, from Tantric perspective, everything can be used. Every sense perception, any vibrant frequency of thought, emotion, feeling. But of course, there is also a bread and butter of spiritual practices, which have meditation at its basis.
Yes, that brings me to my next question, which is that I understand that you adhere to the Advaita Tantra tradition, and that sometimes you don't really adhere to any tradition, that you really have like your own peculiar way that, of course, drinks and nourishes from several traditions. And I found a statement from a previous interview where you said that you don't really belong to any tradition, and then you made a little adjustment, and you said that if you did, then you would belong to the tradition of the heart. Could you please explain us in more detail what you mean by that? I mean, what is the heart? Is it a metaphor? Is it a reference of the heart chakra? Or does your teaching perhaps lead to a tendering of the heart, or to make it more powerful?
It's a good question, and I mean, when I say it's a good question, it's a good question. It's a good question.
Okay.
Because, yes, of course, the heart here stands for the metaphor of that which cannot be spoken of, nor measured, nor approximated, nor referred to, with any means available to us, which will pinpoint that what transcends everything. So in other words, the heart here spoken of, as it is always spoken of in those traditions where the heart was understood as the very seat of the self. In other words, the heart is spoken of here in relation to being and becoming. It's being and becoming reconciled in that what is contained in the heart as the heart. So, in a way, breaking this metaphor into a more accessible language will defeat the purpose. For the purpose of the metaphor is to depart from the ordinary use of the language where we are bound by that continuous, I would say, and constant need to reorganize, articulate, and settle on something, because this is in the nature of the mind to come up with some solution. Solution here is rooted in that rational nature of thought.
Yes.
Whereas the heart precisely represents the ending of all these endeavors, the heart represents the state of pure transcendence, where language and any means to measure this with any rational approach falls apart or simply rests where it belongs. So the metaphor, if you will, if I were truly to follow the traditions where that metaphor is being spoken of with great reverence, just to give us an example, it is equally important in Tantra, in Vedic related traditions, as well as mystical dimension of Islam known as Sufism.
Yes.
And we can find these direct allusions in Gnostic traditions of Christianity, when the heart is spoken of as that chalice, or the heart is spoken of as that cup. And entering the heart or resting in the heart is in relation, of course, not to just an emotional resonance, although emotion and feeling here certainly serves as an entrance point. Because feeling by its nature is more refined than thought can ever be. We may have no understanding, but we all have a feeling about something. We often find that the feeling fulfills that very, very important part where all other attempts fall away or simply do not deliver. So therefore, we don't discard the feeling, but when we speak of the heart, we do not refer it to any of the psychic or spiritual centers. It is certainly not limited to the psychic or spiritual center spoken of as the heart chakra. It is spoken of as that which transcends even this realm of the heart center or any higher centers. It's really that what is alpha and omega, beginning and end of all experiencing. So therefore, that adjustments, though, not belonging to any tradition, may be a way of trying to make a statement. And yet again, there is this tradition which speaks of the heart as the seat of consciousness. And this is, I find, the most at home in terms of strongest reference that can be given. And as that, even if tentative flavor to those for whom access to more specific language maybe act as a certain predicament. So therefore the heart is a universal symbol.
So if I'm understanding, when you say that the heart is the seat of the consciousness, are you saying that the mind itself arises from the heart? Is it its origin?
We could say that everything arises from the heart, because everything rises from the ocean of being. So the heart, though spoken of as the seat, also exemplifies the void, the great void that the tradition of Buddhism often speaks of. And the cavity of the heart, as often referred to in various other traditions, the cavity of the heart, or the sacred chamber, or the sacred cave, all stand for that great void where everything rises from and subsides. Arises from and subsides. So certainly the mind also.
Yes, of course. And in which way are the works that you lead, that you offer, directed to acknowledge this reality, to make the people be aware of this truth?
Well, this, of course, like with everything, there are parameters and boundaries of existing traditional references, and one can, if one of course has access to the tradition, if tradition speaks to one's heart, to one's understanding, and likewise if there is an access which is very important, so that one can relate this, introducing these profound perspectives, profound doctrines. But the proof of the pudding is, of course, in the direct experience. So the work is really between that, it's that balancing act of bringing the highest understanding, and yet how is that then refers to through direct experience. So there's a lot could be said to that, because the core of this work, of course, is, as with all perennial traditions, is based on practices which leads to direct experiencing of transcendence. So therefore, meditative methodologies are the, again, bread and butter. This is where indispensable in our workshops, in our retreat settings, the meditations.
And you mean sitting meditation?
Sitting meditations, yes. Sitting meditations, but when we say sitting meditations, of course, this is where perhaps we need to maybe tweak, elaborate a little bit. Because there are different teethers, different degrees of when we speak about meditative practices. And the funny thing is that when people come to these retreats that we offer at the moment, sitting still is the last thing we do, because a lot is going on, a lot is happening in the sittings. And at times it could cause some people a certain disconcern or certain doubts, because people come from various walks of life.
Yes.
And people come from various spiritual backgrounds. Some of them have that most strict element of sitting still, sitting upright, sitting in a very, very silent, quiet environment. And yet in our retreats, the dynamic aspect, which Tantra is very well known for, that dynamic aspect which assists immediately to these transformative processes, because it initiates a certain very, very subtle movements at the level of the life force, at the level of the pranic body. And these movements are indispensable. They are not the goal in themselves. No. This is very important that we have a clear understanding. These are the, if you will, indispensable part of what goes into that, what essentially could be spoken of as the quickening process. Okay. It's as if when we gather together and the program begins, there is this speeding up, quickening. And that quickening facilitates tremendous realignment of energetic flows, exemplified by the pranic currents. And pranic, just to clarify, is pertinent to that Sanskrit term prana, which can be explained as that pneuma, the ancient Greek term pneuma, that force, that power, that even if we speak of vitality, consciousness, being able to perceive, experience, it is all ignited by that force, by that life force, which, as it's often spoken of, dwells in the body. So we work at that level because it seems to be the most effective. If we felt that it was the most effective to sit still and to facilitate that, perhaps we would have utilized this. But I am a meditator with decades of experience. And I know the difference between sitting still and just touching the, let's say, certain layers or levels of transcendence. That's one thing. But going deeper brings about the possibility whereby deeper-seated material exemplified by these accumulated experiences of all sorts. The tradition speaks of as psychic repository, is being brought to the surface because the nervous system begins to release this. So again, this is another side effect or byproduct of this work, is that it immediately, as it quickens, as it speeds up the frequency in the field, in the individual field, then it immediately, in correspondence to that, there is a freeing of the system, of the nervous system, of all this material, which otherwise simply acts as that what creates this more contracted, stressed out sense of separation and so forth, and translating into the story of me being isolated, me being cut off, me not being experiencing this wondrous state of coherence and union with everything else.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But let me tell you, I tried once to meditate together with one of your students, and it was a total failure, because I said, well, let's meditate together. I will zit sasen and shikantasa, and you do it your way. And I was astonished. I said, well, will you ever shut up? Or will you stop moving? I was just like trying to be like a rock and trying to go deep in my silence inside, not even moving. And I was really surprised. It made me really curious about the method, because I was then aware that that probably your meditation method unleashes this neural or pneuma or this forces that probably I don't know if I'll ever have I'll get to have access with my with this sober and minimalistic and really contained and really introverted style of meditation.
Well, it's an interesting topic, and I don't know if it belongs to this conversation or not, but this is maybe where certain sense of not sure even how to define it, but this is how there is this certain perhaps area of dissonance between certain more settled ways of how the true transformative work is understood. And in my experience, the transformation of consciousness is inseparable from tremendous realignment of these pranic currents. This realignment of pranic currents in itself brings about the possibility for a true awakening to take place. We're not speaking about certain shifts, satoris, certain experiences or spiritual experiences, but fundamental shift in identity, which in a way, if we are to borrow now that understanding present and prevalent in Vedic and Tantric traditions, is that it is the life force itself which essentially gives us that sense of who we are in our relationship to the body, mind, feelings, story, narrative, the whole thing, all that our personal universe, our personal world, in a way, is the result of that frequency, of that vibration at the base of our personality. So at the base of our personality is our consciousness. So in other words, consciousness here and that what we speak of, that indwelling life force, cannot be separated because it's one and the other. It's just different reference point.
Yes.
Yet when we speak of it as consciousness, it often comes across and may sound as a kind of like abstract, hard to define quality of our ability to comprehend, because that's all properties of consciousness, of our ability to be aware. And yet, there is this also undeniable fact of us being in the body, in relationship to our body, with all its functioning, with all its biochemistry. And the neuroscience is making very interesting, at the moment, suggestions and breakthroughs that we cannot even separate the way we are as conscious beings from that lab, from that alchemical laboratory of who we are in all its in all the ways of how our endocrine system functions, how our parasympathetic and sympathetic parts of the nervous system function. So Tantra, on the other hand, is very unapologetic in a sense of how the body is consciousness and consciousness is the body. So this is a primal tenet of its philosophical doctrines, that the work is done with the body, at the level of the body, which brings about breakthrough in consciousness, because body and consciousness are not in opposition.
Are separated.
You know, it's one and the same reality, but our experience here, because it is fragmented, gives this rise of somehow of this understanding, body, mind, then the finer categories and so forth. So maybe this is where the dialogue among spiritual traditions and spiritual circles and communities will unfold, you know, what truly comprises the true transformation of awareness. And this is interesting because not only speaking about specifics of this work, but even if we to bring examples of those beings who broke free, awakened profoundly to the level of reality which is beyond the confinements of this body-mind conglomerate, it doesn't matter which traditions they belong to.
Of course.
There are certain extraordinary similarities of these breakthroughs. So even if the analogy is being made here, then we are in for some very, 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 I think, useful and very helpful ways of how to go forward in all this, because I do have this, people come from, let's say, aforementioned Zen Buddhism, and then they've been ordained, they've been practicing, they've been extraordinarily held by this tradition. They represent this tradition. And yet suddenly this profound awakening takes place, and let me put it this way, and messes up this whole setup of what otherwise been considered as already perfectly presenting itself spiritual outlook, you know, a certain well-defined, well-agreed upon spiritual understanding. So we're not even speaking about some hypothetical perspectives that one tradition may say, well, you have it that way, but there is a possibility to arrive to that same state of consciousness through simply bypassing that what is, let's say, spoken in Tantra or Tantra yoga somehow, because that's inconsistent with those very often uneasy examples. These examples, they, in a way, contrary to what otherwise often spoken in relation to this tradition, that here is one perspective, here is a completely different perspective. So there is something to that maybe a more of a facade of spiritual perspective, something that may be understood in terms of its formal aspect, in terms of its shell, in terms of its form. And yet, when it comes to the transformation, it's a messy process. Therefore, often we give this example of a birth of a new being, childbirth. So in other words, what we perhaps set to re-examine here in the light of direct experiences of those who go through these transformative processes firsthand is what belongs to the formal aspect of any tradition, of any teaching, and what belongs to that kitchen, to a more messy side, to the transformation of consciousness. And very often the metaphor of the childbirth is given because it's a very messy process, very messy process. And so the birthing into new consciousness has that element on so many levels. So that departure from that sense of separate self into the entirely new platform or perspective cannot be just at the expense of no matter how clear-sightful understanding or simply seeing this through in transcendence, because the physiology need to catch up. And now physiology is not separate from our nervous system. Our nervous system is an expression of the physiology, and nervous system in itself, in turn, in itself is the expression of consciousness. So hence this, in Tantra, this has always been understood. That connection of how consciousness dwells in the body. It dwells in the body by virtue of vibrations exemplified by the ability of our nervous system to have this very complex experience, which perhaps available only to human beings.
And speaking about those levels of awakening, way before the total enlightenment or awakening, how's the process? How do the teachings unfold in their practical lives of the students? What's the transformation path? How does it expresses?
Well, of course, it's down to individual cases, because though we share this nervous system of being human beings, there are a lot of very, very unique aspects by ways of how this unfolds or will unfold in any given moment in time in this or that individual. So there is no such thing as brushing everything with the same white brush.
Okay.
But there are certain shared territory and certain accumulated way of where the applicational aspect of what then is spoken of as a methodology is, as it were, tried and tested. And that tried and tested element here is, in a way, that what allows and affords the work with tangible results. Because if all this was just hearsay and some kind of open to infinitude of possibilities, then it will be nearly impossible to conduct any work. And when we say conduct any work, we're conducting research in consciousness. So, of course, things don't go by the book. Just
Yes.
like in every chemical lab, there are certain, if you will, accelerations, certain ingredients, when they put together, they produce another element altogether. So this is the nature of alchemical transformation. This is the nature of transformation of consciousness. So again, it oscillates between that what is being observed and that what gives us a certain sense of reassurance and confidence to carry on, to conduct that experiment in consciousness.
Yes.
And that what is open to this, what every life experiment is open to. You know, it's volatile in nature. I would even say that there are several spiritual masters throughout the time when they spoke about spiritual transformation and when they spoke about adopting this attitude in life where one essentially reclaims one's divine essence. It's not a placid process, and it is spoken of very often as indeed a dangerous one. Therefore I say it has a volatile nature, because we are dealing with a lot of unpredictable ways with which our psyche throws that material to the surface. So this is where the dynamics of the guide and the one who assumes that role of a student comes into play full force. This is the stuff of legend of the teacher-student relationships and the work in the Sangha. Because when we are in the so-called dormant state of consciousness, we only have that access, limited access, to that portion of which we are aware, that portion of ourselves. But a tremendous amount of information is simply hidden from us. It's not available. And yet this work brings it to the surface. So there often is not enough tools, let alone wisdom, to deal with that.
And it could even be the shadow, the hidden, the unconscious aspects of the
completely,
psyche.
completely.
Okay.
Very often is. Very often these subconscious and unconscious levels begin to release, the information begin to be released from that level. And this is why a true spiritual work it has this element of, it has that element of a warrior, like the one who is already has this predisposition to being met with unexpected, to being met with that what one would not like, what one would be challenged by. Because if we expect spirituality to be all that rose petals, sweet silks, lovely fragrance, sandalwood and lovely conversations and shanti, and then Om Namah Shivaya, then we may very, very quickly run into this predicament of not liking what we experience, not liking how that what we project onto others being reflected back onto us. But that's where the real work really unfolds. This is where the real work begins. So in other words, again, we can't draw the line between sitting on the cushion, on the yoga mat, and having these experiences, and then being challenged by our responses. So the line has to be blurred. It will be good. The quicker that line begins to blur, the better it is for our evolution. Because otherwise there's a danger of that subtle, ever so subtle split, which begins to grow into this spiritual persona versus, my face in the world, and
Yes.
So you can see that one can be all very, very polite and very, very amiable, but that doesn't mean that that's the state of affairs inside the house.
Okay. Might this be related with might be the reason for why so many artists are attracted by the Tantric tradition. This question has two sides, because we all know that you used to be a very successful visual artist yourself. How does it relate to the involvement of an artist to make this kind of works? Or tell us a bit about your own experience, if you like to.
It's interesting because I've heard about these observations and this sort of something that not sure how much studies were made, but I've certainly heard, going back to the mid to late 90s, that there is something about Tantra being really favored by the more creative personalities and
Yes.
artist-like, and because in every true creative process, authentic creative process, there is a tremendous place for unexpected.
Yes.
The element of being thrown off the comfort zone. I mean, creative process and the comfort zone, in fact, it's these are the incompatible strategies. If one wants to walk and completely have everything by the book, then one doesn't really know how the films are made, how paintings are made, and how poetries are come into being. So there is this edge to the process. Creativity itself has this edge, and Tantra very much all about that. It's about authentic ways of living. It's embracing the polarity of one's being at the start of the process, at the start, at the get-going. It's never about transcending and going away and somehow hoping it never happened, or hoping this was not me, or hoping it's somehow an aspect that I don't like and I would like to get rid of. It's a working consciously with the full set of circumstances. So I think this explains that kind of a maybe not yet fully acknowledged and spoken about marriage between certain spiritual traditions and certain psychic predispositions that now you've brought up.
Yes.
In the example of artists being more, gravitating more towards this kind of path, because Tantra is an edge. Among the spiritual perspective, it has a sharp edge, and to walk it requires authenticity and courage. So it has this very distinctive qualities, which, of course, all true spiritual paths would require. That satya, that truthfulness, and virya, that warrior-like courage to face all the way through, or being faced with one's limitations, to face all that conglomerate of what suddenly begin to present itself. And it's very creative as well. Tantra is such a rich spiritual path. It has this element of, I don't know, it has this thrilling element even there.
Yeah.
You know, that element of thrill. This element of a
challenge.
Challenge, yes, exactly. So, so I don't know how much I can speak about it from my own perspective, because I could say that the more I learned about this profound philosophy, about this way of life, the more I've realized that I was actually at Tantric much earlier than I even considered this to be something that would be considered as a path to embark on. And this is maybe very often, many people can find that what is Tantric methodology really is a certain way of how we relate to life, certain attitude that we take from get going, and what we consider to be worthy of our real investment. So, in a nutshell.
Yeah. So, as far as I understand, following a spiritual path such as the one you teach requires a lot of dedication and an alignment of very specific conditions, to say just the refining of the perception, the diet, the lifestyle habits, time management, etc. And it is more difficult to have these conditions as a student in a country such as Mexico, with a tremendous level of poverty, with violence, with suffering. So what I mean, the question is, would you say that your teachings are meant for everyone, or is your work directed to a few that will further expand the knowledge to the people?
Very valid question. Perhaps before we speak more specifically whether Tantra as a methodology, as practice, and as a way of life is applicable to a country such as Mexico, which is known for its still very challenging conditions that the country is going through, and it has a very unique and distinctive history in terms of the history of this culture, and it's also, I could see also a lot of similarities in the sense of how the country went through social changes, revolutions, reformations. But we should not forget that Tantra itself as a methodology rose in the gutter sometimes in India. In other words, Tantra is not a refined spiritual methodology of the upper classes. Yes, some or certain spiritual doctrines exemplified by very well-known philosophical systems evolved among the elite, spiritual elite, where one would have to be born into a certain social class, certain social strata, even if to be privy to these teachings.
Yes.
Tantra was a revolution. Tantra was essentially an internal movement that swept across Indian subcontinent, sometimes in the Middle Ages, from about 4th century, and for the coming several centuries became widely available and widely practiced, from south to north, east to west, and Tantra shares a lot of perspectives and understandings that are again inseparable from that core of Islamic tradition, exemplified by that Sufi paths, where again the path of Tantra transcends the boundaries of any cultural provenance and orientation, because at its core it doesn't deal with what otherwise requires a certain, I would say, access, where one would need to have means to have that access. And precisely because it works with everything, there are so many ways in how Tantra could be used and how and what it utilizes. Because it utilizes the body as the vehicle. The body with its, with all what in other traditions perhaps considered as on the onset limitations, predicaments, and so forth. So there is this certain element of taking the bull by the horn in Tantra. You know, so what it requires is this rather a certain predisposition. And if that predisposition is there, then really it's not too far-fetched to say that it doesn't matter to what background one belongs to, because it can be practiced in a very, very humble, in a very, very, if we'll say, would say minimal setting, in the sense of what one is, you know,
what it
what
takes,
has,
what it.
yes. So,
But to find a teacher such as you, what would be a way for a newcomer, for instance, in Mexico? Because not all the people are ready, like to go directly into a retreat, a full immersion for several days. Is there literature, or what would you recommend for someone attracted to the teachings?
well, I also have heard that Mexico is quite well known for some of these teachings that some of these tantric teachings they have been taking root, and there's already a certain tradition, because with the arrival of great teachers from India and from the East in the second half of the 20th century, Mexico didn't get lagged behind. I know the transcendental meditation movement enjoyed a great success in terms of how many people took it on in this country. I also know that Siddha Yoga also has enjoyed a great success in terms of the dissemination of this knowledge and its methodologies. So just based on these very two large movements, especially the transcendental meditation one, and the success of these methodologies, and how many people have learned and successfully implemented this, already an indication, or rather indicator, that there is a tremendous interest towards real spiritual work. And to me this is very encouraging, and I think it's something that we should not discount, on the account that every country has its own challenges, every social system structure has its own challenges. It's interesting that sometimes the reverse is also, you know, the reverse is also true. Who is to say that in a country where with the highest level of social structure, where there is a tremendous level of, let's say, social benefits and everything, then very often that in itself overshadows the need for any spiritual work, because one's attention is scattered all over the place at that surface level of enjoyment, because one simply can afford everything that is thrown more and more into that sphere. So really, I'm not sure how we can really draw that. Yes, of course, it also would be unfair to discard the importance of certain standard of living being met, because otherwise where would that be, where would the propensity for spiritual unfoldment come from if one is constantly burdened by how to make a living? But let's not forget the country as India, where that repository where all this was preserved and saved, a country which now enjoys one of the strongest middle class in the world, is known for being in doldrums and tremendous poverty as it gained its independence sometimes in the middle of the 20th century. And yet, despite that unbelievable level of poverty, the spiritual practices and traditions in India did not suffer setbacks. So
Yeah.
it's kind of contrary to the truth, you see? So therefore I would not, let us kind of see this from a more, again, from that perspective where it's not only at the level, because when the soul is ready to evolve, and if the soul happened to be in conditions which may be karmically, right, seen as not favorable, that in itself could act as a fuel, that in itself could act as that force of evolution to rise above the circumstances.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you. Now that you've been in Mexico already for a couple of weeks, do you think that
a couple of months, more like
months already? Do you think the country's ripe? Is it ready to evolve, to make this shift? Related to what you were saying before, because I would say that as long as there is suffering, as in India or in Mexico or elsewhere, there will be a need for a spiritual path. It brings relief to the people, but the moment changes. Of course, it's not the same the 20th century Mexico or as it was before with our really strong Catholic tradition. But my perception, which doesn't count, is that it is changing, that it is opening, that it's like acquiring a degree of maturity. Would you think so as well? And the other way around, I ask it at the same time, why did you choose to come to Mexico? What?
Well, it's an interesting question because I will speak about the personal motivation and why that kind of came. But first, to that what is direct experience, that first and immediate impression. And so far we've been only at the Caribbean side, which of course is more known for its catering for that tourism. But then we were in a deeper pocket of the Molinalco, which is not far from where we are now. And then the retreat itself was in yet another pocket not far from the capital, in Tepoztlan, which is a mythical, very, very spiritually rich area, associated with a very, very rich culture. My impression here is that there is this, I would say immediately, a more heart-based connection that people have compared to many other countries which we have been, in a sense that I find a lot of similarities and allusions with Eastern European, with Asian and Russian nations, in a sense of maybe also Southern cultures that Mexicans somehow naturally belong to. So the response to the work here may not necessarily be picked at the level of that what others maybe from the cultures and countries where that more of a more gravity towards that intellectual, towards that comprehension-based insights through these mental and intellectual capacities. And that to me is actually a plus or a bonus or an access, because again, as what we spoke earlier, in spiritual work, the connection to one's status here, to connection to oneself, is measured not so much how already well prepared one in certain departments, but in a readiness to experience something, which the heart-based attitude is much more immediate.
Yes.
And so this I find definitely that this is a shared experience of several of us, and my wife and I spoke about this, that what we found is that tremendous warmth and that connection, despite the obvious limitations of the language. Both of our kids, by the way, speak a decent Spanish, but we are kind of more of a Spanglish version, going just getting about, and yet that never posed itself as a limitation. There's this, this connection is very, very visceral and palpably felt. So this is speaking from my immediate impression. So how does that translate, and how does that relate to the possibilities, and how that relates to openness to receive directly? It's exactly how the work is being really experienced. It's experienced at the level which not necessarily requires understanding of terms, terminology, and certain access which would be granted only through years of education and study, but through that immediacy of one's willingness to simply experience that what this work offers in the most intimate way, as that what is essentially is not a set of, we're not bringing here another philosophy or kind of another way of life. This is why very often that missionary aspect, is like every spiritual tradition had that element of my path is better, more direct, more true. So therefore that missionary element has been always pushed somehow.
Yes.
But when it comes to this perennial understanding, then often in my work I speak from the perspective of any tradition. Sometimes we speak from the perspective of these pagan traditions that came way before the organized religions. Sometimes we speak from the traditions of shamans, that connection to the primordial forces of nature, connection to these primordial aspects which exemplified in our very intimate but gradually withering away connection to plants, animals, forces of nature as fire, elements, water, wind, and so forth. It could be spoken from even directly from the tradition of the one where someone simply feels more comfortable in understanding. So I often speak about this path in relation to someone who, let's say, belongs to the Christian tradition, and then it's easier for them to grasp it.
Yes.
Because really we're speaking about the universal qualities, and we speak about that which transcends any boundaries of any given tradition. So this is what the path of the heart really exemplifies. In the heart, all isms, all symbols are molten back into the state of its original potentiality. So all the ornaments of this or that tradition are molten back into that state of pure gold, of one's really potential of who we are here, beyond any conceived or preconceived ideas.
I would like to end with that statement. You're giving us so much matter of reflection, but I think that we're also getting like what we meant to get from you, the core, the heart of your knowledge. And hopefully we'll see you again. Well, you already told us that you will be here next year. We'll be looking forward to meet you again. And at the same time, we'll do our job. We'll try to spread a bit just of this, what you just shared today with us in the Spanish speaking world.
Great. I feel very, very humbled by this, and at the same time, I feel honored to be able to bring this in whatever way in our humble efforts to simply share what this is all really about. So I feel good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're
Thank
so
you, Javier.
grateful for your blessing. Thank you.